I should have known something was off the moment I moved into Sycamore Grove. It had all the makings of a suburban paradise: neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and those little American flags people stick in their gardens to feel patriotic. On non-holiday weekdays, the kind of place where neighbors smile too wide and wave just a little too eagerly, like they're auditioning for a commercial about moderately priced family sedans. It was perfect. A little too perfect. And then I met her. Her name was Pamela Ellsworth. If that name doesn't scream owns at least one personalized tote bag that says live, laugh, love, I don't know what does. Pamela wasn't just on the homeowners association board. She was the homeowners association, the self-appointed queen of our little kingdom, a woman who wielded power over the neighborhood with the unhinged fervor of a small-town dictator. I crossed her path on day 3, which, in hindsight, was at least 2 days later than I should have expected. I was standing in my driveway admiring my truck, a sturdy, slightly beat-up Ford F-150, when I heard the sound of expensive orthopedic shoes clicking against pavement. "Excuse me?" a voice chirped, artificially sweet and laced with the kind of condescension only decades of unchecked entitlement can cultivate. I turned, and there she was. Pamela, in all her glory. Mid-50s, hair the color of oversteeped tea, wearing an aggressively floral blouse that looked like it had been stolen from a retirement home's common area. She had a clipboard in one hand and a smug, knowing expression on her face. "That thing," she said, gesturing at my truck like it was a rusted-out refrigerator someone had abandoned on the curb, "is an eyesore." I blinked. "My truck? We have standards in Sycamore Grove," she continued, tisking, as if she were deeply, personally wounded by the presence of my vehicle. "And according to our HOA guidelines, all personal vehicles must be visually harmonious with the community's aesthetic." Visually harmonious? What the hell did that even mean? I took a slow breath. "Pamela, it's a truck." She smiled, the kind of smile a cat gives a bird before pouncing. "It's a commercial vehicle." "No, it's not," I said, exasperated. "It's my personal truck. I drive it to work. I drive it to get groceries. I'm not out here hauling construction materials or running a mobile pet grooming business." "Well," she sniffed, flipping through her clipboard like she was reading the fine print of some obscure bylaw, "it looks commercial, and we simply cannot have that." At that moment, I realized 3 things. Pamela Ellsworth had too much time on her hands. Pamela Ellsworth had too much power. Pamela Ellsworth had chosen me as her latest victim. I played it cool at first, thinking she'd get bored and find another poor soul to torment. Maybe someone whose mailbox was half an inch too tall or who had the audacity to own a garden gnome. But Pamela was relentless. It started small. A friendly reminder taped to my door about vehicle regulations. Then, a formal warning in my mailbox. Next, a fine. A fine for non-compliance with community standards. I tried reasoning with her. "Pamela, I've read the bylaws. There's nothing in there about personal trucks." "Well," she said, with a plastic smile that barely masked her glee, "the HOA board has the right to interpret the rules as necessary." I gritted my teeth. "You are the HOA board." Her grin widened. "Exactly." I decided to ignore her big mistake. A few days later, I woke up to find a second fine tucked under my windshield wiper, this time for prolonged driveway storage. Apparently, because I parked in my own driveway overnight, my truck now qualified as an abandoned vehicle. I was still fuming about that when the next escalation arrived, an official-looking letter warning that if I didn't remove my truck, the HOA had the authority to tow it at my expense. That's when I knew Pamela had lost her damn mind. I wasn't about to roll over and let some clipboard-wielding tyrant push me around. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I went straight to City Hall, pulled up the local vehicle ordinances, and confirmed that nothing Pamela was doing was remotely legal. The HOA had no right to tow my vehicle. Armed with that knowledge, I decided to push back. The next time Pamela stormed up my driveway, clipboard in hand, I met her with a smirk. "You can't tow my truck," I said. "I checked the city regulations." "You're making this up." Pamela's eye twitched. Just a little. "Well," she said, voice syrupy sweet. We'll just see about that. I should have known she wouldn't give up that easily. 2 days later, I walked outside to find a tow truck idling in front of my driveway. Pamela stood beside it, looking downright giddy. "It's been reported," she said, practically vibrating with self-righteous excitement. "Unregistered commercial vehicle, violating HOA bylaws. I told you this would happen." I laughed, shaking my head. "Pamela, you really don't want to do this." "Oh, I do," she purred. And that's when the driver of the tow truck stepped out, walked around my vehicle, and stopped dead in his tracks. Because parked in my driveway, looking, to an untrained eye, like an ordinary truck, was an unmarked police cruiser. Pamela's smirk wavered. "What?" I crossed my arms. "Oh, yeah, forgot to mention—" I leaned in. "I work for the county sheriff's department." Pamela went pale. And I was just getting started. For a moment, the only sound was the low idle of the tow truck's engine. The driver, some poor guy who'd clearly just been called for what he thought was a routine pickup, stood frozen, his gaze flicking between me, Pamela, and the vehicle in question. I decided to break the silence. "Yeah," I said, stretching the word out as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge. "See this commercial vehicle you're so concerned about? It's actually county property." I turned toward the tow truck driver. "So, buddy, unless you want to explain to the sheriff's department why you just hooked up an unmarked cruiser, I'd suggest you unhook it, now." Pamela let out a noise somewhere between a gasp and a squeak. The tow truck driver, wisely realizing he'd just stepped into a situation way above his pay grade, immediately sprang into action. He practically tripped over himself, reversing the winch, unfastening the hooks like his life depended on it. I gave him a nod. "Smart choice." Pamela, meanwhile, was still standing there, gaping like a fish out of water. I turned back to her. "Pamela, you do realize this is a felony, right?" Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she found her voice. A felony?" "Tampering with a law enforcement vehicle," I said, letting that little factoid sink in. "Attempted theft of government property." I tilted my head, pretending to consider. "Hell, I'm sure I could find a few more charges if I wanted to be thorough." Pamela made a noise like someone had just tightened a corset around her ribs. "But," I said, crossing my arms, "I'll tell you what. Maybe I don't have to press charges. Maybe this can just be a little lesson." Pamela latched onto that lifeline like a drowning woman. "Yes," she breathed, nodding furiously. "Yes, of course, a lesson. Just a misunderstanding." I narrowed my eyes. "In that case, I expect no more notices, no more fines, no more threats." Of course. And," I added, stepping just a little closer, "I'd suggest you start rethinking your interpretation of the HOA rules, because if I so much as see another passive-aggressive note on my door, we're gonna have another lesson, and that one will involve an official police report." Pamela nodded so fast I thought her neck might snap. The tow truck was already pulling away, the driver clearly wanting to get as far from this mess as possible. I watched him disappear down the street before turning back to Pamela. "You have a nice day now," I said with a smirk. Then I walked inside and shut the door, leaving Pamela to sputter on my driveway like a malfunctioning lawn sprinkler. For the next few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Pamela had scurried back into whatever lair she came from, and for the first time since I'd moved in, I wasn't waking up to notices taped to my door or surprise finds in my mailbox. It was almost suspicious. And then, exactly 1 week later, the retaliation began. At first, it was subtle. My trash cans mysteriously weren't collected on garbage day, even though everyone else's were. Then, the neighborhood landscapers, who were contracted by the HOA, suddenly started accidentally blowing piles of leaves onto my lawn. Then came the mail issues. My packages, which had always been delivered to my doorstep, were now suddenly misplaced or left at the wrong houses. A couple of neighbors, ones who didn't seem to be in Pamela's inner circle, confessed that she'd been personally giving the mail carriers updated delivery instructions. And then, the real kicker. Pamela started hosting HOA meetings specifically about me. I only found out because my next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hernandez, let it slip. "I thought you should know," she told me one afternoon, her sharp eyes full of disapproval. "Pamela's been going around saying you're bringing down the property values with your attitude." "My attitude?" I repeated. "She's telling people you're a disruptive presence, a threat to the neighborhood." I blinked. "I'm the threat? The cop who pays his HOA dues on time?" Mrs. Hernandez snorted. "She's desperate. She lost her power over you, so now she's trying to turn everyone else against you." I let out a slow breath, running a hand through my hair. "This woman is relentless," Mrs. Hernandez nodded. "You might want to watch your back." I took her advice seriously. I started keeping an eye out, watching for any new signs of Pamela's meddling. Sure enough, she started sending anonymous complaints to the county. Everything from unauthorized vehicle storage to suspicious activity. Of course, nothing ever came of them. I was in law enforcement, for God's sake. I knew exactly how to handle these bogus claims, but Pamela wasn't giving up. No, she was just getting bolder. And then, just when I thought she'd hit her peak of insanity, Pamela made the single worst decision of her meddling career. She tried to have my house foreclosed. I came home one evening to find an official-looking letter in my mailbox. At first, I thought it was another one of Pamela's pathetic warnings, until I saw the words "Lion Notice" printed in big, bold letters. She had filed a lien on my property. Why? Because, according to the document, I had unpaid HOA fees, which was interesting considering I had proof of every single payment. I stared at the paper, my blood running ice cold. She had falsified financial records. She had lied to a legal entity. She had committed fraud. I grinned. Pamela had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. I didn't waste a second. I gathered every HOA payment receipt, every cashed check, every automated transaction from my bank statement, and lined them up like ammunition. Then I did some digging. It turned out Pamela had not just filed a fraudulent lien against my property. She had a pattern of doing this to other residents she didn't like. I spoke with a few neighbors, the ones who had mysteriously moved out over the past couple of years. Turns out, I wasn't the first one she had targeted. Pamela had been fabricating violations, inflating HOA fees, and using legal threats to push people into either complying or selling their homes at a loss. And who was conveniently always in the loop, ready to suggest a buyer for those undervalued. Holmes, her husband, a real estate agent. I had her. It was time for my HOA meeting. I went straight to the county clerk's office the next morning and filed a fraud report against Pamela and the HOA. I handed over my documentation, my neighbors, testimonies, and everything I'd found on her shady dealings. I might have been willing to let her get away with being a petty tyrant, but mortgage fraud? That was a different beast. Then I took it a step further. I sent everything I had to a local investigative news team. By the time Pamela figured out what was happening, it was already too late. 2 days later, a squad of county auditors showed up at her door, accompanied by the sheriff's department, my department. I made sure to be on duty that day, just to watch it all unfold. She tried to bluster her way through it. But the numbers didn't lie. When confronted with the evidence, her carefully curated world started crumbling fast. The lien on my property, fraudulent, the manipulated HOA fees, illegal. The string of previous homeowners she had forced out, enough for a class action lawsuit, and the final nail in her coffin. The news crew, parked on the curb, cameras rolling as Pamela was placed in handcuffs. The charges? Wire fraud, falsification of financial records, and misuse of HOA funds. Her reign of terror was over. The neighborhood, once eerily obedient to Pamela's rule, turned against her in record time. The HOA board, what was left of it, immediately distanced themselves, scrambling, to save their own hides. A new board was formed, one that was actually fair. The first order of business? Repealing Pamela's absurd rules. My truck, now officially HOA approved, sat proudly in my driveway, untouched. And as for Pamela? Well, she spent the next few months battling a very public legal case. Her husband, realizing his real estate empire, was crumbling right along with her reputation, filed for divorce. The lawsuits piled up. The fines bled her dry. By the time it was over, she was forced to sell her own house, the same house she had weaponized against others for years. The best part? Guess who bought it? Mrs. Hernandez's daughter. I made sure to help her move in. We had a big welcome party. Pamela, on the other hand, left in disgrace. Last I heard, she was living in a condo across town, under a very strict HOA. And me? I stayed right where I was, in my driveway, sipping a beer next to my completely legal truck, watching as Sycamore Grove finally became the peaceful neighborhood it was always meant to be. Justice had been served, and damn, did it feel good.